All right, so this is the first lecture of the second unit. This is the skeletal system basically, but mostly osseous tissue is what we'll be looking at, and the structure of bone and how it's organized and how it has this sort of dynamic nature. It's constantly changing and turning over, and so we'll look at those processes and how they work. So in this unit we're going to do bone, which is this chapter, of course, and we'll do a little bit on the articulations, and then finally we'll finish up with the skeletal system, which will be the skeletal muscular system, which will be the last unit. And that sort of correlates nicely with what we're doing in lab, which includes the same thing, bones, muscles, and joints. So it'll nice overlap there between these two sections in lab and lecture. So this first chapter then is bone tissue, and as I was saying at the outset, what we'll be looking at primarily is the skeletal system, and this does include other structures, but for the most part we'll be looking at bones of the skeleton. So cartilage, ligaments, and other types of things are part of this, but that's what we'll be focusing on. And so primary functions of the skeletal system that we'll be looking at, some I think are pretty obvious and pretty self-evident, like support, for instance, right? The skeletal system provides a nice framework of support for the body. Your muscles attach to the bones, of course, and when the muscles contract, these skeletons provide leverage. So leverage or force of motion, also something that's probably fairly self-evident. Protection is another one, right? Think about your skull and how it protects your brain, or your vertebrae and how it protects the spinal cord, or your sternum and ribs and how they protect your lungs and heart, right? Nice firm layer, solid layer of protection. So those three things, I would say, probably, if you haven't studied this a lot, have some idea of those are functions of the skeletal system. Some of the things you may not be as aware of would be, for instance, blood cell production. We'll look at that when we do the first chapter in ANP2. We'll look more closely at this process, how it forms in bone marrow. But then also storage of minerals, okay? Things like calcium, right? Your bone is made up of primarily calcium. 2/3 of your bone's content is made up of calcium. Calcium phosphate, actually, crystallized calcium phosphate. And so it's a great storage site for calcium. And so we'll look at that process, how your body uses the bone and the skeletal system as a storage site for these minerals, and that it can actually extract some of these calcium ions when it's needed. So those are the things that we'll be looking at primarily as we go through the functionality and look at these different aspects of bones. So bones can be classified based on their shape, what type of markings or organization do we see on the surface or inside the tissue. The shapes are, for the most part, we'll spend the most time looking at are long bones, but they're also sutural, irregular, short, flat, and sesamoid bones. And you can see all 6 of the different variety of bones here in this image. So sutural bones are small or irregular bones that are found on a suture line, for instance. So between the flat bones of the skull, when you do the skull, you'll be able to find a sutural bone, also referred to as a Hormonal bone. Irregular bones are bones, just like the name indicates, that they're not regular, right? They have more complex types of shapes, so like the pelvic bone or your vertebrae. These are very unique structures. So you can see a sutural bone right here along a suture line, right? And then an irregular bone, like a vertebrae, right? So, there's nothing very typical about that. It's a very unique organization. Short bones are very small and thick, things we'll see like at the wrist or ankle. Flat bones are things like your sternum or ribs or skull, right? They're very thin structures. So there you can see short bones like in your hand or wrist, flat bones in the skull, for instance. And then long bones. Long bones are long and thin. These are the things like our arms and legs and hands and feet and fingers and toes. Toes are all made up. And these are probably the most common type of bone that you'll see in terms of structure in the body. And then sesamoid bones, things like the patella, are a great example of that. These develop inside tendons. And so there you can see a long bone, and there you can see a sesamoid depth. So those are different bones based on shape. Now, some other ways we can look at bones, and these are important because you'll be learning all these bone markings when you do your anatomy stuff. And bone markings are either depressions or grooves or elevations or tunnels that we see on a bone. And you can look, there's a nice listing in this table of all of the different types of bone markings. So things you're going to come across are things like trochanter, for instance, which is a large projection, or for instance, a head or a neck, or a condyle. Condyle is an articular surface. Fossa is a depression. A sinus is a chamber within a bone. So lots of different types of structures that we're going to see, different markings on bones. And again, you'll be identifying a lot of those different markings in the bones as you learn them in lab. Okay? And then so here are some images of those different types of structures and bone markings that you'll see on bone. The structure of a long bone, as I said, long bone will probably be one of the more common typical bones that we look at. And long bone is made up of a diaphysis, which is the long shaft in the middle, which typically has a hollowed medullary cavity and on the inside of the shaft. The epiphyses then are the wide parts at each end, which are typically made more of spongy bone, whereas the diaphysis is typically made of compact bone. And then the metaphysis is where the diaphysis and the epiphyses actually meet. And so you can see this in a nice image here, right? Here is your diaphysis, which is the shaft. You can see it has the medullary cavity and is made up of compact bone. Okay? Up in the epiphyses, which is up here, right, made mostly of spongy bone. So different types of bone, and we'll look at that. And then the metaphysis is sort of the space in between. We'll talk about that because that is indicative of growth and formation. If that's continuing to progress, we'll talk about that. Flat bone is structured like the parietal bone of the skull to resemble a sandwich of spongy bone, right? It's sort of two layers of compact bone with spongy bone in between. So that's typical of what you see in a flat bone. We'll be looking at those later on. All right, so that gives us an idea of how the tissues or bones are sort of organized and some general features that we're going to see on bones. And now we can start to look at the actual tissue itself and sort of what it's made of and how it's organized. So bone itself is a supporting connective tissue. We had this tissue in lab in our first lab unit. And like other connective tissue, bone tissue has cells, but it also is mostly comprised of the extracellular components, the extracellular matrix, things other than cells. Okay? And so the extracellular matrix, which is the vast majority of bone, is made up primarily of calcium and protein fibers, which are collagen. And then there are 4 different types of cells: osteoblasts, cytoclasts, and osteoprogenitor cells. The matrix, again, contains primarily calcium. There are caniculi, which are pathways that form blood vessels to connect these adjacent bone cells. So the bone matrix, again, one component is minerals. So 2/3 of bone is what's called calcium phosphate, right? This also is referred to as crystals of hydroxyapatite. And this is what the vast majority of the bone is made of, so calcium phosphate. The other primary third of this extracellular component are the matrix proteins, which is primarily collagen fibers. So we have this matrix being made of primarily calcium phosphate and collagen fibers, which gives it a lot of strength, but also gives it some resilience as well. Okay, so that's the extracellular matrix. And so this ratio of collagen to calcium phosphate is very important to maintain. And you can see that in the strength, but also the resilience of the bone. If you have too much calcium phosphate, right, the bone might be brittle, right? It might break much easier, whereas if you have too much collagen, which bends a little bit more, right? It may not be strong enough to resist gravity and forces of our body weight and things like that. So this ratio of 2/3 to 1/3 in the extracellular matrix is really important that it is maintained. So that's the extracellular matrix, right? Calcium phosphate and collagen fibers. The rest of bone mass, which is only about 1 or 2% of bone mass, are the cells. And there are 4 different types of cells. You have osteocytes, osteoblasts, osteoprogenitor cells, and osteoclasts. Okay, and so you can see all 4 of these bone cells. We want to take a look at each one and see what their significance is. So the first one are what are called osteocytes, right? And osteocytes are mature bone cells that are completely surrounded by bone matrix. Their job is to maintain the bone matrix. They live in what are called lacunae, which are just little chambers, essentially, for the cell to reside. We saw those in chondrocytes. Chondrocytes also reside in the lacunae. And they are connected by canaliculi, which are these cytoplasmic extensions that link adjacent osteocytes. And so the osteocytes, again, 2 major functions: maintain the mineral content in the cells, but also help with repair of damaged cells. So here's a nice image where you can see the mature osteocyte completely surrounded by bone matrix, and you can see the cytoplasmic extension linking adjacent osteocytes. Next type of bone cell of the 4 that you're going to see is what's called an osteoblast. Osteoblasts are immature bone cells, right? If osteocytes were mature bone cells, osteoblasts then are the precursor to osteocytes. Osteoblasts are immature bone cells that essentially form and secrete the compounds of the matrix. We call that osteogenesis, right? And it produces what's called osteoid. Osteoid is the matrix of the bone, but it's ultimately not yet calcified. Once it's calcified, then that osteoblast becomes an osteocyte. Okay? So osteoblasts are really important. Osteoblasts essentially form bone, right? And so as we're going to see this dynamic nature of bone, osteoblasts are going to play a critical role in that process. So here you can see an osteoblast forming the osteoid, which is the matrix. Once the matrix is completely surrounded by bone, then, is calcified, then it becomes an osteocyte. All right? So that's the osteoblast. Next type is what's called an osteoprogenitor cell, which is a mesenchymal cell that divides or produces osteoblasts. Right? These are stem cells, essentially, that produce osteoblasts, and so they can assist in fracture repair because they're going to help osteoblasts proliferate. And so here in this image you can see an osteoprogenitor cell and the osteoblasts that are formed from the osteoprogenitor cell. So those first 3 that we talked about: osteoprogenitor cell, which forms osteoblasts, which then can convert and will ultimately become osteocytes. Those first 3 that we just talked about, of the 4, are all involved in bone building and bone formation. The only one that's not is what's called an osteoclast, right? Osteoclast is one actually that breaks down bone. Very interesting. It actually secretes acids and protein digesting enzymes that dissolve bone matrix, but also can release the stored minerals that are in the bone. So for instance, if your body is in need of calcium, right? Stimulate osteoclast activity. Osteoclasts can release calcium in the bloodstream, and we call that process osteolysis. Right? And so that's when we see these bone matrix being resorbed, essentially. And so these osteoclasts also are going to play a really important role in this dynamic nature of bone, where we see osteoblasts building bone and osteoclasts breaking down bone. And so here's a nice shot of an osteoclast, this giant multinucleate cells which releases these acids and enzymes to basically dissolve bone matrix. All right? So talking about these osteoblasts and osteoclasts, of course, like everything with the body, homeostasis is essential. Right? Bone building by the osteoclast and bone recycling by the osteoclast must balance. Right? If you have more osteoclast activity than osteoblast activity, can you see how bones would become weak? Right? Exercise, weight-bearing exercise especially, can cause osteoblasts to build bone. So that's important. Balance between osteoblasts and osteoclasts is very important. Typically in the early years, right, our first 20, 30 years or so, osteoblast activity predominates. Okay, and so bones typically are very healthy and strong. You don't typically see cases of osteoporosis, for instance, in younger individuals unless it's some sort of abnormal disease state. Typically, bones are very robust, and even in the 40s, it even sort of levels out a little bit, but you're still probably in good shape. When it can get dangerous potentially is when osteoclast activity can predominate, and when that happens, the bone becomes weaker. If osteoblasts dominate, bones can become stronger. And so we'll look at how exercise can play a significant role, for instance, in helping our bones become stronger. All right, so as we look at the two types of bone, compact versus spongy bone, we can see quite a difference, right? Compact bone is made up of osteons, and this is what you saw in your lab manual, right? This structure right here kind of looks like a tree stump is an osteon. It has this sort of central canal that has like blood vessels and things like that. You can see the osteocytes in the matrix, and so this is what compact bone is made of, right? It's made of these sections that are sort of wrapped in these circumferential lamellae to help bind these osteons together, and you can see a nice shot of some more osteons there. And then here's also a nice shot where you can see osteons. In that central canal, you can see the blood vessels. Now, spongy bone, then, is a little bit different from compact bone. Spongy bone does not have osteons and is made up of an open network of struts and plates called trabeculae. And you can see that in this image right here, trabeculae of spongy bone. See how it's not complete and solid. It's sort of made up of these different sections. So it's a little bit different in terms of how it's organized. So trabeculae is not having the blood vessels, and here's a nice shot where you can see the spongy bone, which again typically is found in the epiphyses of long bones, is often where you'll see spongy bone. Okay? Compact bone is covered with a membrane. It has periosteum on the outside. Okay? Periosteum is just a layer that fibrous and cellular layer that helps isolate the bone, provides a route for circulation, but also helps participate in bone growth and bone repair. So you can see that right here, periosteum on the outside of bone. So if this is a cross section through the shaft of a long bone, we're looking at the outer layer of periosteum. Okay? The inner layer is referred to as the endosteum. The endosteum is where we see a lot of these cell populations like osteoblasts and osteoprogenitor cells, and we see active bone growth and repair in this location. So here you can see the inner layer, right? And this section's been sort of ripped up. You can see the endosteum. You can see osteoclasts. You can see osteoprogenitor cells. You can see osteoblasts forming bone matrix. You get a nice feel, there's some mature osteocytes in that location. All right? So bones grow typically until about, in our 20s. Usually could be less, could be more, depends on the person. But the process of bone formation is called osteogenesis. And this process of ossification is when you actually replace other tissue with bone. And ossification comes in two main forms. You have what's called endochondral ossification and intramembranous ossification. And essentially this is what our bone comes from. In embryologic and fetal development, our bones don't start out as bones, right? They start out as connective tissue and then ultimately are converted into bone. And so what we want to do is look at each one of these processes so you have an understanding of how this works. Endochondral ossification is the first type of ossification. And this is bone that is ossifying, but it's starting or originating as hyaline cartilage, right? Most of the bones in our body, like long bones for instance, originated as hyaline cartilage and ultimately were converted into bone during development. So we want to look at the 6 steps involved in endochondral ossification to see how this process works. So the first thing is that as this hyaline cartilage is enlarging, like it's your humerus or your femur, right? As it gets larger, as the fetus develops, the chondrocytes are going to start to enlarge as well. And as they enlarge greatly in size, basically we start to see calcification of those areas, and the chondrocytes essentially die off, and we start to see these sort of cavities left within the cartilage, hyaline cartilage matrix. Okay? So that's the first step. As it's developing, we see the chondrocytes in this hyaline cartilage matrix to sort of die off and leave these, cavities essentially in this location. Step 2, we start to see blood vessels start to grow along the outside and convert. We also see the inner portion sort of converted to osteoblasts, and a superficial layer of bone is formed. In step 3, those blood vessels that were migrating to the outer edge of the bone actually penetrate. And this is important to note because this ultimately becomes what's called the primary ossification center. And the primary ossification center is where we see the shaft taking shape, right? The diaphysis starting to take shape as blood vessels penetrate and form inside that primary ossification center. We see spongy bones starting to form as well, and growth continues. In step 4, that medullary cavity starts to become more evident as the vessels sort of expand and resorption and remodeling continues. We see that hollowing out of the medullary cavity. We can also see the beginnings of the formation of what's called a metaphysis, which, as I said, is going to be very important in identifying bone growth and how far along bone growth is. Okay? Last 2 steps, in step 5, we start to see the creation and formation of a secondary ossification center, formation of the epiphyses. And you can see it goes through a very similar process. Spongy bone is formed, blood vessels are penetrating, metaphysis is still present. And then finally, in step 6, the epiphyses are filled with spongy bone. And you have 2 really interesting parts to it. At the top, at the tip of these long bones, the hyaline cartilage is not ossified, and that still remains today. The hyaline cartilage never ossifies, and we refer to that as articular cartilage. The other part of cartilage, very interesting, is that metaphyseal cartilage, which ultimately becomes epiphyseal cartilage, and as long as that cartilage is present in that location between the diaphysis and the epiphysis, we now have bone growth that will continue to happen. Okay? And so that's a really important component. And so as you can see, this is sort of a close-up of that area where you have the zone of proliferation, right, which is the epiphyseal cartilage matrix. As long as that cartilage is still there and still undergoing division and proliferating, growth will continue to happen. Once that zone of proliferation becomes ossified, then you know bone growth is complete. And so in young bone, again, as long as those epiphyseal plates, the cartilage that is not turned to bone, is still there, growth is still possible. Okay? In adult bone, typically these epiphyseal plates have disappeared, leaving epiphyseal lines, and we have a more dense, spongy bone. Okay? And so again, when long bone stops growing, right, you can see this epiphyseal line in an X-ray. So if you look at these images, you can see here is an X-ray image of growing epiphyseal cartilage. And you can see there are lots of locations where there is space. Wherever you see all those spaces, that is just indicative of cartilage that has not yet ossified, right? And so those are epiphyseal cartilage that still have yet to turn to bone. As long as those are present, and here's another really good one, as long as those are present, you're still going to have growth possible. In the adult bone, you can see no more spaces, right? They've left what are called epiphyseal lines instead of that space that was there previously, and now you know that the bone is no longer growing, and that's the furthest it will grow. So, endochondral growth is also referred to as growth in length. Okay, as the bone, that's how we see with the cartilage, as long as it's present, the bone will continue to grow in length. Appositional growth is growth in diameter. And basically what that means is that in terms of diameter, bone is being added to the surface, of course, but then bone on the inner side, inner layer, needs to be resorbed as well at that location. And so we start to see a narrow cavity that widens as bone is laid down on the surface. And so we call that appositional growth. And you can see that nicely in this chart. Okay? So that's endochondral ossification. The other primary form of ossification is what's known as intramembranous ossification. This is also called dermal ossification because basically, instead of hyaline cartilage that is converted to bone, here we have a dermal connective tissue that is converted into bone. And so oftentimes things like your jaw or your clavicle or bones of your skull, for instance, these start out as dermal tissue and ultimately go through this process called intramembranous ossification. And there are 3 steps in intramembranous ossification I want you to know. The first is that you have this dermal connective tissue, which you can see sort of in this picture here. This dermal connective tissue contains mesenchymal cells. If you recall, mesenchymal cells have the ability to differentiate into osteoblasts. When osteoblasts are present, then you know they're going to start to form bone, and you can see that right there. Okay, and so that's what's happening in the first step, is that these mesenchymal cells differentiate into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts then begin to form bone. Okay? In the second step, we see the blood vessels sort of start to form and develop within the bone, and then finally over time we'll do a model of the spongy bone will be converted. We'll also have a layer of compact bone on the surface. So that's intramembranous ossification. Similar process to endochondral, but really it's what is being converted, and that we see a dermal tissue being converted to bone in intramembranous as opposed to hyaline cartilage in endochondral ossification. All right, so that's growth and bone formation. One of the last major concepts we want to look at here over the last part of this lecture is bone remodeling. And remodeling is the process that the adult skeleton, is involved in throughout its life. It's how it maintains itself, it's the way it replaces mineral reserves, and it's constantly recycling and renewing bone matrix. And so it involves this really important interplay between osteoblasts and osteoclasts. If we call osteoblasts form bone, osteoclasts break up bone, essentially. Right? And so these 2 cells primarily are involved in this process of remodeling. Okay? And remodeling, again, it's constantly doing this, replacing, and the turnover rate can vary depending mostly on age, but it could be other factors. But basically, if what you're depositing in bone is greater than what you're removing, right, what the osteoblasts are doing is greater than the osteoclasts, then your bones are going to be stronger. If breaking down by the osteoclasts is faster, then the bones are going to be weaker. Pretty straightforward concept. And we talked about some of those topics a little bit earlier. But to give you an idea, there are different things that are going to impact the activity of these osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And those would be exercise, hormones, and nutrition. First thing we can look at is exercise. Exercise is fairly well studied as being something that is going to help bone. It's going to stimulate osteoblast activity. And this is done by putting heavy stress on bones. Okay? So exercise activities like strength training or running or anything where you're putting stress on your bones, that stress stimulates osteoblast activity. Osteoblasts then lay more bone, and therefore you're going to have heavier, stronger, thicker bones. Right? And so that would be, if you think of a very simple analogy of comparing a weightlifter to a couch potato, right? Someone who's pretty regularly putting stress in their bones compared with someone who's not putting regular stress in their bones. Someone who's doing it regularly obviously is going to have much thicker, stronger bones. Someone who's not has much greater risk for bones becoming weaker. Okay, and that's what happens when people get older. Oftentimes they're less active, not getting as much exercise. Hormonal factors, nutritional factors also are at play. Could be genetic factors too. But exercise is one thing that's definitely known to have a positive impact on bones typically. So, heavily stressed bones again become thicker and stronger. That allows these bones to then adapt to the stress, but bone degeneration can occur fairly quickly. Just even as much as a few weeks of activity, you can see a pretty good loss of bone mass. Okay? So that's exercise, right? The more active you are, the more stress you're putting on the bones, the chances are you're going to have healthier, stronger bones. So that's one big important factor. Another really important factor are nutritional components, right? Obviously, your bone is made up 2/3 of calcium and phosphate, so you need a dietary source of calcium and phosphate, right, to ensure that you have the adequate amount of these essential components for your bone. Okay? The hormone calcitrol, which is formed from vitamin D, as we talked about when we did the skin, helps with the absorption of that calcium and phosphorus that we ingest in our diet. So that's very important as well, that you're getting enough sun exposure so that you can absorb the calcium and phosphorus in your digestive pathway that you're consuming. Some other nutritional components that are really important. Vitamin C is really important. It helps with collagen synthesis as well as osteoblast activity. Vitamin A stimulates osteoblast activity. Vitamins K and B12 help with the formation of bone proteins. So we have a lot of nutritional components that are going to have a significant impact on the health of our bones, both from a osteoblast activity standpoint, but also from collagen, right? That's the other really big component is collagen fibers in terms of the extracellular matrix. So that's nutritional factors. The other one is hormonal, right? We have growth hormone and thyroxine, which stimulate bone growth. Sex hormones, estrogen and androgen, are going to stimulate osteoblasts. And then calcitonin and PTH are going to regulate calcium and phosphate levels. So this is also some really important concepts that we're going to look at. And so this is a nice table here that names all the different hormones that are involved in bone growth and maintenance, where they come from, and then what effect they have on the skeletal system. Okay? And so we want to look at these and get a feel for how they work. And one we want to spend the most time on, though, is calcitonin and PTH. These are really important hormones to understand in terms of your body or your skeleton being a calcium resource. Okay? As you know, your bones are made up 2/3 of calcium, so it has a very significant amount of calcium and other minerals. And what you also may not know is that calcium is also the most abundant mineral in the body. And calcium is vital to membrane function, neuron function, muscle cells. We'll look at muscle cell activity. It's significant. Without calcium, basically muscle contraction will not happen. So it's a really important ion in the body. And so, like anything else in the body, we want to achieve homeostasis and keep your blood calcium levels in balance, right? You don't want your blood calcium levels to be too high. You don't want your blood calcium levels to be too low. It's going to be right in homeostasis. Okay? And your skeleton participates in achieving calcium homeostasis. And so you can see in this image here, with a slide, 99% of the body's calcium is found in the bone. Okay? And so it's really important to help maintain that. So calcium regulation, again, the amount of calcium in our blood must be closely regulated, and homeostasis must be maintained. Okay? And it's achieved by two hormones, an interplay between two hormones, calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. These essentially control storage, absorption, and excretion of calcium from our blood. Okay? And so these two hormones can act at the bones, in the digestive pathway, and the kidneys. And so when you think about it, there are these two hormones. Parathyroid hormone comes from parathyroid gland. Parathyroid gland sits in the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland and releases PTH, or parathyroid hormone. Calcitonin is released from the thyroid gland, and they're both going to impact calcium ion levels. Essentially, PTH is going to increase calcium ion levels. Calcitonin is going to decrease calcium ion levels. And how they do it is displayed very nicely in this figure from your textbook. Okay? So, the typical range in your plasma for the amount of calcium you want to have in your plasma, in your blood, is 8.5 to 11 milligrams per deciliter, right? So if you measure the amount of calcium in your blood, it should be in that range, right? That's what the body's goal is, to achieve homeostasis. That is homeostasis, okay? What happens if it falls out of that range? Well, let's take first, what if it goes below 8.5? It's too low. You do not have enough calcium in your blood. Right? This is dangerous because calcium is a really important ion involved, as I said, in muscle contraction, in neuron function, in membrane function. So you need to get it back in balance. And so if it starts to drop, get too low, right? Parathyroid gland releases PTH. PTH can do several things. Number one, it can stimulate osteoclasts, right? How is this going to help blood calcium levels rise? Well, when you break down bone is made of calcium, the calcium is going to be released into the bloodstream. Blood calcium is going to go up. Okay, so that's one significant way that it does it, right? Through stimulating osteoclast activity. It can also increase what calcium we're absorbing in our intestine and also limit the amount of calcium lost through the urine or through the kidneys, right? And so those three things together, we're seeing holding on or absorbing more calcium and more calcium being released in the bloodstream. As a result, calcium levels go up, back into range, all right? So that's what happens if your blood calcium gets too low and you need to increase them, okay? The other way would be if it gets too high, right? What if it goes above? What if it goes like 11.2, or if it's getting too high? You don't want high levels of blood calcium, just like you don't want elevated levels of blood sugar or elevated blood pressure, right? Your body wants homeostasis, and so if it gets too high, the thyroid gland will respond by releasing calcitonin. Calcitonin also acts at those three locations. First, it will act at the bones by slowing osteoclasts, right? If you slow osteoclasts, less calcium is going to be released in the blood, and you can bring calcium levels back down. It can also slow how much calcium you're absorbing in the diet, and it can also allow more calcium to be excreted in the urine. All three components then allow for calcium levels to come back down, right? And so those are your two methods. It's a homeostatic mechanism between these two hormones. So make sure you have a good understanding of PTH and calcitonin and how they work and how they impact blood calcium levels. All right, so the last things we want to look at here are just injury and repair. First thing, fractures, right? Fractures, cracks, or breaks in bones that happen, right? Typically caused by some sort of physical stress, right? Like if you're, I don't know, kid's playing on a jungle gym, right, and falls off and lands on his arm, right, and might break his arm, right? It's a pretty significant trauma or impact. And what's going to happen when that occurs? Well, you're going to have a break, and as a result, you're going to see several things occurring that ultimately lead to the repair of the bone. Okay? First thing is bleeding, right? We saw previously bones are highly vascularized structures, right? A lot of blood vessels. So if you break a bone, you're going to break some vessels, and you're going to get bleeding, and you get a fracture hematoma. And so after a few hours, you get a large blood clot, and this fracture hematoma develops. Over time, this callus will form, and spongy bone will start to sort of migrate and proliferate to sort of stabilize the area where the injury occurred. Obviously, it's very important is that this, when you have a break, that it's set properly, right? That's why they do casting and things like that to make sure the repair is happening back, the way it's supposed to be. After a while, that cartilage is replaced by bone, and bone continues to sort of remodel the area. The vascular pathways are reestablished, which are really important to make sure that bone continues to thrive and survive. And then finally, you'll see swelling over the fracture, and over time, this will be remodeled and basically be back in business. So it's good news, like we've seen before. Injury to some tissues are, repair is not as likely, right? Like nervous tissue or myocardial tissue. But things like skin and bone, they repair pretty easily. So that's a plus. All right. So what happens as we age? Well, as we get older, typically our bones become thinner and weaker. Osteopenia is the first sort of step in this progression that could potentially lead to what's called osteoporosis, which is severe bone loss. And so the epiphyses, vertebrae, and jaws are typically most affected by weakening bones. Again, a lot of it has to do with the lack of hormones. As a result, we have fragile limbs, reduction in height, tooth loss could also occur. And if it continues, right, you could ultimately get what's called osteoporosis. And this is severe bone loss which really impacts normal function. And as you can see, it's higher in women over the age of 45 than men. And the reason for that is primarily due to postmenopausal women do not produce as much estrogen, or if any at all, compared with men who continue to produce testosterone. And as we know, sex hormone is a driver of osteoblast activity. So if you lose a driver of osteoblast activity, you can see there's a danger there for your bones to become weaker. Also, as people get older, they can be less active, and that also could cause bones to weaken. So there are several things at play there. And so a way to measure bone density is through what's called a DEXA bone scan. A DEXA bone scan, as you can see in this slide here, really just gives you a score based on a curve that gives you normal bone mineral density. And a lot of clinics and health doctors are starting to do sort of baseline DEXA scanning to sort of see where your bone density is at, and then maybe test it over 5 or 10 years to see what the progression is happening. But typically you'll see a decline, and this image shows really nicely what normal spongy bone looks like versus osteoporosis. And you can see the bone is just worn away more, right? It's chewed up. There are more holes in the bone, and it's not as strong and as robust. And so that could be, very impactful. It can really impact function. Hormones, again, play a significant role. Estrogens and androgens help maintain bone loss, so when you lose those hormones, your bone loss will accelerate, especially in women. Cancer can also release, certain cancerous tissues can release osteoclast activating factor. It stimulates osteoclast and can produce severe osteoporosis. I know in multiple myeloma, that's one of the things that happens is people have severe bone issues and then really super high blood calcium levels, right? Because the osteoclasts are breaking down bone so much, releasing tons of calcium in the bloodstream, and that can cause other problems like kidney issues and other types of things. So those are the types of things we're seeing with aging. So aging definitely takes a pretty significant toll on the skeletal system. All right, so that wraps up this lecture. The next lecture will be on articulations, which isn't a lot, maybe just, a small subset of the entire chapter. And then the big thrust of this unit is going to be skeletal muscle. There's a lot to sort of talk about and go over with skeletal muscle, so we'll get that done as well.